Imagine standing on a wooden dock somewhere along the Baltic coast in the year 1250. The air is cold, carrying the smell of fish and pine tar, and the kind of salt that clings to everything. The water in front of you is grey-green and restless, and somewhere beyond the fog there are ships, heavy, deep-bellied merchant vessels moving through the mist like slow thoughts. They are carrying things that will decide whether kingdoms survive the winter. They are carrying grain that keeps cities from starving, furs that keep nobles warm enough to think about war, and salted fish that feed soldiers and pilgrims and monks and peasants from one end of the continent to the other. The men who own these ships are not kings. They are not knights or bishops or lords of any land. They are merchants. And within another century they will be the most powerful political force in Northern Europe, not through conquest, not through divine right, not through the inherited blood of dynasties, but through something far more lasting and far more ruthless, the control of trade itself. This is the story of the Hanseatic League, and it is one of the most remarkable stories in all of human history, precisely because it is so easy to misread. On the surface, it looks like a story about commerce, about the buying and selling of goods across the Baltic and North Seas in the medieval period, and on that level, it is genuinely fascinating. But beneath that surface, this is a story about power. It is a story about how a loose confederation of merchant cities, with no standing army, no unified currency, no single sovereign ruler, and no legal basis in any feudal or ecclesiastical framework that the medieval world recognized, managed to bring kings to their knees, lay siege to entire countries, blockade the food supply of kingdoms, and dictate the terms of treaties that shaped the borders and economies of Europe for centuries. The Hanseatic League did not conquer Northern Europe. It bought it, strangled it, starved it, and negotiated with it until the map bent to the merchant's will. To understand how they did this, you need to first understand the world they inherited, because the Hansa did not emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from chaos, from vulnerability, from the particular kind of danger that existed for anyone trying to move goods across the northern seas in the early medieval period. The Baltic Sea is one of the most strategically important bodies of water in European history, and for most of the early Middle Ages it was also one of the most dangerous. Not dangerous in the dramatic, cliff-faced, storm-racked way of the Atlantic. The Baltic is relatively shallow, its storms are fierce but survivable, but dangerous in a more insidious way. It was dangerous because it was contested. The coastlines that bordered it in the 10th, 11th and 12th centuries were a patchwork of competing powers, none of which was strong enough to impose order, on the whole, and all of which were strong enough to make commerce ruinously expensive. There were Scandinavian kingdoms in the north, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, each internally fractious, each taxing passing ships at every strait and sound and harbour. There were Slavic peoples along the southern coast, Wends, Poles, Prussians, whose relationships with the German-speaking lands to their west ranged from tense to actively violent. There were Viking-descended raiders who had never quite stopped raiding, even as they settled into something resembling farmers and traders. And there was the fundamental problem that anyone moving goods along this coastline faced. You could be taxed, robbed, shipwrecked, or simply stranded in a foreign port where no one spoke your language and no law protected your goods. The early medieval merchant was a figure of enormous physical courage and financial desperation in roughly equal measure. To move a cargo from Hamburg to Riga in the year 1150 required navigating a series of near-impossible negotiations. Which lord controlled this stretch of coastline? Would they honour the safe conduct purchased from the lord of the previous port? If the ship was damaged and had to put in unexpectedly, could the merchant expect his goods to be protected? Or would the local authority simply claim them under the doctrine of strand right, the ancient, deeply inconvenient custom that said anything washed ashore or brought to shore in distress belonged to whoever owned the shore? The answer to that last question, for most of the early medieval period, was that the local authority would take what it wanted, and there was very little a foreign merchant could do about it. This is the world the Hanseatic League was born into, and this is the problem it was designed to solve. Not by eliminating the risks of trade, the Baltic would remain a cold and treacherous sea no matter what any merchant guild decreed, but by creating a political and economic architecture that made those risks manageable, and that gave merchants the collective leverage to force kings and princes and city councils to respect their interests in ways that no individual merchant, however wealthy, could ever demand alone. Consider what that vulnerability looked like in practice. Imagine a merchant from somewhere in the interior of what is now Germany, from Cologne, say, or Westphalia, who has assembled a cargo of finished woolen cloth, perhaps purchased from one of the great cloth fairs of the Rhineland, intending to sell it in the Baltic markets where cloth of that quality commanded a substantial premium. He has hired a ship and a crew, loaded his goods, and set out along the coast. Before he even reaches the Baltic proper, he must pass through a series of toll points controlled by various lords and cities, each of whom charges a fee for the privilege of passing through their jurisdiction. Some of these fees are fixed by ancient custom. Others are essentially arbitrary, set by the whim of a local lord who has discovered that merchants passing through his territory will pay almost anything to keep moving. The merchant has budgeted for these costs. They are the cost of doing business in this world, but he cannot know in advance exactly how many tolls he will face or how much each one will demand. Once he reaches the Baltic coast, he faces a different kind of uncertainty. The city he has chosen as his destination may have changed its policies toward foreign merchants since he last visited. A new lord may have taken power and may not recognize the safe conduct document that the previous lord issued. The local merchant community may have organized politically to exclude foreign competitors from the most profitable parts of the market. His ship may be damaged in a storm, forcing him to put in at a port he had not planned to visit, where the doctrine of strand right, that ancient, deeply inconvenient custom, gives the local lord grounds to claim his cargo. And if any of these misfortunes occur, there is no institution to which he can appeal, no court that has jurisdiction over disputes between a foreign merchant and a local lord, no commercial treaty that clearly specifies his rights and obligations. He is, in the most literal sense, on his own. This is why the merchants sought each other out. Not out of sentiment, not out of shared ethnic identity, though the German identity of the early Hanseatic merchants was a genuine bond, but out of the cold logic of survival. A merchant who travelled in convoy with other merchants was harder to rob and harder to cheat than a merchant who travelled alone. A merchant who could say to a potentially hostile local authority, "I represent not just myself but a community of 50 other merchants, who will all hear how I was treated, and all of whom will respond accordingly," had a negotiating position that a lone merchant lacked entirely. And a community of merchants that was large enough, rich enough, and organised enough to present the credible threat of collective commercial retaliation, refusing to trade, withdrawing their presence, redirecting their goods to competing markets, had something approaching genuine political power, even in a world that had no theoretical framework for commercial organisations of this kind. The word Hansa itself is ancient, rooted in old Germanic languages, and it simply means a group of people travelling together for protection. It was used for centuries before the League existed, describing the convoys of merchants who banded together to move goods through dangerous territory, the commercial equivalent of a wagon train. There is something almost poignant about that origin. The most sophisticated economic organisation of the medieval world began as the simplest possible response to danger. People who needed to travel together decided to travel together. The sophistication came later, built layer by layer over 2 centuries of negotiation, conflict, and ruthless commercial logic. But the foundation was always the same, the insight that in a dangerous and legally uncertain world, collective organisation was worth more than individual wealth. The geography of the Baltic reinforced this insight at every turn. The sea is almost entirely enclosed, connected to the North Sea only through the narrow straits of the Danish archipelago. This enclosure meant that controlling the straits was controlling the Baltic, a fact that gave the Kingdom of Denmark an enormous structural advantage in the politics of the region, and that meant every merchant who wanted to move goods between the Baltic and the North Sea had to pass through Danish-controlled waters and pay the tolls that the Danish crown levied on that passage. The Sound Toll, as it came to be called, was in some years the single largest source of royal revenue in the Danish kingdom, funded by the merchant ships of a dozen nations. The power this gave Denmark was real, and was bitterly resented by everyone who paid the toll, which is to say by every merchant who traded between the Baltic and the North Sea, which is to say by virtually every member of the Hanseatic League. The political fragmentation of the Baltic southern coast was equally significant. The lands between the River Oder in the west and the Gulf of Finland in the east, what we now know as northern Poland, the Kaliningrad region, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, were in the 12th and 13th centuries a mosaic of Slavic, Baltic and Finnic peoples, some settled and agricultural, some semi-nomadic, most pagan, and all of them in various states of conflict with each other and with the expanding Christian powers to their west. The Teutonic Knights, the German military order that had been redirected from its original mission in the Holy Land to the task of Christianizing the pagan Baltic peoples, conducted a long, brutal campaign of conquest along this coast throughout the 13th century, establishing a domain that stretched from Prussia in the west to the eastern shores of the Gulf of Finland. This conquest created, whatever its costs in human suffering, a coastline that was politically organized and at least nominally subject to consistent legal authority, and this was enormously valuable to the German merchants who followed in the knights' wake. The Teutonic Order was, among other things, a commercial organization as well as a military one, and it organized the grain trade of its Prussian territories with a systematic efficiency that made it a de facto partner of the Hanseatic League in the earliest centuries of the Baltic trade. Before the League, before the convoys, before the carefully negotiated privileges and the carefully maintained contours, there was all of this. The danger, the uncertainty, the cold mathematics of individual vulnerability in a world of collective threats. The Hanseatic League did not emerge from idealism. It emerged from the daily experience of merchants who had found, through hard and sometimes fatal experience, that acting alone in this world was not an option. Understanding what they built requires sitting with that vulnerability for a moment, understanding the world not as it became after the Hansa shaped it, but as it was before, when a single merchant's fortune could be wiped out by a single shipwreck, a single rapacious toll collector, or a single royal decree issued by a king who had never met a merchant and didn't particularly want to. The city of Lübeck sits on a narrow tongue of land where the Trava River meets the Wakenitz, about 15 kilometers from the Baltic coast. If you were designing a city for the purposes of commerce, you could hardly do better than this location. It sits almost exactly at the point where the Baltic meets the overland routes to the North Sea, meaning that goods moving between the two great northern bodies of water had to pass through or near Lübeck, or travel far out of their way. This geographic advantage was recognized early, but Lübeck's rise to become the Queen of the Hansa, as she was eventually called, was not simply a matter of geography. It was a matter of an extraordinarily long series of smart decisions made over more than a century, combined with one stroke of nearly miraculous political luck. The city was originally founded in the 1140s by a German count named Adolf II of Holstein, on the site of an older Slavic settlement. It burned down within a few years and was refounded in 1158 or 1159 by Henry the Lion, the Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, one of the most powerful princes in the Holy Roman Empire, and a man with a talent for building things that would outlast him. Henry's Lübeck was a deliberate creation, planted at the junction of sea routes and land routes, with the explicit purpose of becoming a trading hub. He granted the city a charter of remarkable generosity by medieval standards, giving its merchants legal protections and commercial freedoms that made it an attractive destination for traders from across the German-speaking world. Within a generation, Lübeck had become one of the most important ports on the Baltic, and it had done so by making itself genuinely useful to the people who used it. Henry the Lion is worth pausing on for a moment, because he represents a type that was more common in the 12th century than is sometimes remembered. The great lord who understood commerce not just as a source of revenue but as a source of power, and who therefore invested in its infrastructure with the same strategic intelligence that a later monarch might invest in fortifications or alliances. Henry did not simply grant Lübeck its freedoms and walk away. He organized the overland trade routes that fed the city, established the markets that attracted merchants, and used his political network across the north to ensure that Lübeck's commercial advantages were reinforced at every point where his authority could be exercised. When he fell from power in 1180, exiled by Emperor Frederick Barbarossa after a decade of accumulating enemies, the city he had built was already self-sustaining. The merchants of Lübeck did not collapse when their patron fell. They had already learned to operate without a patron, and the loss of Henry's support, paradoxical as it sounds, may have been one of the events that forced them to develop the organizational independence that would eventually become the League's greatest strength. The early Lübeck merchant was typically a man of the German interior, drawn from the towns of Westphalia, Saxony, and the Rhine Valley, who found in the Baltic trade an opportunity for wealth that was unavailable to him at home. The structure of medieval German society offered relatively few avenues for social mobility, and while the merchant class was growing in importance throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, it still occupied an awkward position, too wealthy to be ignored, too low-born to be fully respected. The Baltic was different. In the Baltic, what mattered was not your ancestry, but your ability to move goods reliably and to honour your commercial obligations. This is a world that will feel recognisable to anyone who has ever worked in a genuinely meritocratic environment. Your reputation was your most valuable asset, and it was built not through blood or land, but through the simple, repeated demonstration that you could be trusted. The first seeds of what would become the Hanseatic League were planted not in Lübeck itself, but on the island of Gotland, which sits roughly in the centre of the Baltic and had been a hub of northern trade since at least the Viking Age. The merchants of Visby, Gotland's main town, were already operating a sophisticated commercial network by the time Lübeck was founded, and when German merchants began arriving in significant numbers in the mid-12th century, they found in Visby both a model and a partner. The Germans established their own community on the island, a German quarter with its own church, its own legal customs and its own mechanisms for resolving commercial disputes. And this community, the community of German merchants frequenting Gotland, is perhaps the earliest ancestor of the Hanseatic League in any formal sense. Visby itself was one of the great cities of the medieval Baltic, and walking its streets today, the city walls still largely intact, the ruins of its medieval churches rising above the rooftops, the harbour below, you can feel the weight of what it once was. It had been a meeting place of peoples for centuries before the German merchants arrived. Gotlanders, Swedes, Danes, Slavs, even Russians had all left their commercial and cultural traces on the island. The German merchants who came in the 12th century were not the first to recognise the island's commercial value. They were the ones who organised that value most systematically, who built the institutional framework that transformed a place of occasional meetings into a permanent commercial institution. What made this community significant was not its size, but its structure. The merchants who belonged to it agreed to operate under a common legal framework, to share information about trading conditions, to extend credit to one another on the basis of shared trust rather than individual relationship, and to present a united front in negotiations with local authorities. This is the core insight that made the Hansa possible, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment because it is so counterintuitive. These men were competitors. They were competing for the same cargoes, the same customers, the same routes. By any logic of commercial self-interest, they should have been trying to undercut one another, to conceal information, to gain advantage by any means available. Instead, they agreed to cooperate, because they had realised something that would not be formally articulated in economic theory for another 6 centuries, that in an environment of widespread legal uncertainty and physical danger, the gains from cooperation outweighed the gains from competition. The man who cheated his commercial brother today would find, tomorrow, that no one would trade with him, because word travelled fast in the small world of Baltic merchants, and a reputation for unreliability was a commercial death sentence. The political crisis that allowed the League to formalise was the slow collapse of Henry the Lion's power in Germany after 1180, when he was exiled by Emperor Frederick Barbarossa following a long political struggle. With their great patron gone, the merchants of Lübeck had to find ways to protect themselves without the support of a powerful princely patron. What they discovered was that they could protect themselves, if they worked together. The city received an imperial charter in 1226 that made it a free imperial city, answerable directly to the emperor rather than to any territorial lord, and this status, combined with the commercial weight the city had already accumulated, gave Lübeck a kind of sovereignty that no other merchant city in the north could match at the time. Over the following decades, Lübeck began entering into formal agreements with other cities. Hamburg first, in 1241, in a treaty that promised mutual protection of each other's merchants on the roads between the two cities, particularly against the robberies that plagued the overland route connecting the Baltic to the North Sea. This Lübeck-Hamburg agreement is often cited as the founding moment of the Hansa, in the formal sense, though the name Hanseatic League itself would not be used for another century. What it established was a principle, that cities, acting together, could protect what individual merchants could not protect alone. That principle, extended city by city, decade by decade, eventually connected over 200 urban communities across a vast arc of northern Europe, stretching from the Baltic states in the east to the Zuiderzee in the west, from the Norwegian coast in the north to the Rhineland in the south. The expansion was shaped by a geography of interest. The Wendish cities of the western Baltic, Lübeck, Hamburg, Wismar, Rostock, Stralsund, Lüneburg, formed the core of the network, connected by shared routes and shared concerns. Around this core in ever wider rings were the cities of the eastern Baltic, Danzig, Elbing, Königsberg, Riga, Reval, Narva, cities that had grown up along the routes of the Teutonic Knights' conquest and that were dominated by German merchant settlers with the same commercial interests as their cousins in the west. To the south were the great cities of the Rhine and Westphalia, Cologne, Dortmund, Münster, Soest, connected to the Baltic network through overland routes and through their participation in the cloth trade. At the western extremity of the network stood the Dutch cities Utrecht, Deventer, Kampen, Zwolle, whose position on the rivers connecting the Baltic to the North Sea made them natural partners. The growth was not rapid, and it was never centrally planned. New cities joined because they wanted access to the commercial network and the legal protections the League could offer. The League accepted them because each new member expanded the network's reach and added to the collective weight the merchants could bring to bear on negotiations with sovereigns. It was, in the most literal sense, a network effect, and medieval merchants, who had no vocabulary for such things, were living one of history's most dramatic demonstrations of its power. There is a building that still stands in Bergen, Norway, that tells you almost everything you need to know about how the Hanseatic League actually exercised its power. It is a long, narrow structure of old timber, dark with centuries of salt air and wood smoke standing on the Bryggen Wharf. Bryggen simply means the wharf in Norwegian, and it is part of a row of similar buildings that have stood in roughly this configuration since the 14th century. The buildings are beautiful in that severe, functional way that northern medieval architecture often achieves, all vertical lines and careful proportions, and they are inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List as one of the best preserved examples of Hanseatic commercial infrastructure anywhere in the world. But what they were, when they were built, was something more interesting than a heritage site. They were a city within a city, a community of German merchants who lived, worked, worshipped, and governed themselves almost entirely separately from the Norwegian population surrounding them, under German law in the German language, according to German commercial customs for the better part of 2 centuries. This is the Kontor, and it is one of the most extraordinary institutions the medieval world produced. The word itself simply means counting house, or office, but a Hanseatic Kontor was far more than a place of business. It was a self-contained mercantile republic embedded within a foreign city, operating under privileges extracted from local rulers through a combination of commercial indispensability and political pressure. The 4 great Kontors, in Bruges, in Bergen, in Novgorod, and in London, were the anchors of the entire Hanseatic system, the fixed points around which the whole network of trade routes rotated, and the instruments through which the League projected its power into the 4 corners of northern Europe. The Kontor in Bergen was the most dramatically isolated of the 4. The German merchants who lived and worked there were, by the rules of their own community, forbidden to marry Norwegian women, forbidden to socialise extensively with the Norwegian population, and forbidden to trade independently outside the Kontor's collective arrangements. These rules sound oppressive to modern ears, but they served a specific commercial purpose. They prevented the gradual assimilation of individual merchants into the local population, which would have weakened their collective identity and their loyalty to the League. A merchant who had married a Norwegian woman and established a Norwegian household had Norwegian interests. The League needed merchants who had Hanseatic interests, and the Kontor system was designed to ensure that those interests remained primary. The Bergen Kontor controlled something that was, in the medieval period, almost literally priceless: stockfish. Stockfish is dried cod, dried without salt in the cold air of the Norwegian coast, hung on wooden frames and left to freeze and thaw and dry until it has lost most of its weight but retained most of its nutritional value, becoming a commodity that can be stored for years without spoiling and shipped vast distances without refrigeration. In a world without refrigeration of any kind, where most people lived dangerously close to the margins of subsistence, this combination of properties made stockfish one of the most important foods in Europe. It fed the population of inland cities throughout the year. It fed armies on campaign. It fed the fleets of pilgrims travelling to Rome or Santiago de Compostela. The Catholic Church's requirement that its adherents abstain from meat on Fridays and throughout Lent, a period of roughly 40 days, created an enormous, predictable, recurring demand for preserved fish that could last through the entire season without going bad. Stockfish met this demand perfectly, and the Hanseatic merchants of Bergen controlled its supply. The Kontor in Bruges occupied the opposite end of the commercial spectrum. Where Bergen was remote, harsh, and focused on a single commodity, Bruges was the most sophisticated marketplace in northern Europe, a city so dense with international commerce that it had essentially become the economic capital of the medieval world, a place where merchants from Venice and Genoa and Barcelona met merchants from the Baltic and the Rhine and the English coast, where letters of credit issued by Florentine banking houses were redeemed, where the price of pepper from the Indian Ocean was negotiated by men who had never been within 3,000 miles of India. The Hanseatic Kontor in Bruges, called the German Merchant House, served as the point where the League's goods entered the Mediterranean trading networks, and where the products of the south entered the northern distribution system. The profits that passed through this single building over the course of a century or two would beg a description. Bruges itself was, in the 13th and 14th centuries, one of the most extraordinary cities in Europe, a place of canals and cloth halls and merchant palaces that expressed, in brick and stone, the accumulated wealth of 3 centuries of commerce. The city's harbour at Dam and later the deep inlet of the Zwin connected it to the sea, and ships from every maritime nation in Europe crowded these approaches during the trade fairs and the regular commercial season. The Hanseatic merchants were among the most prominent foreign commercial communities in Bruges, their Kontor one of the most powerful institutional presences in a city that was full of powerful institutional presences. The Hose, as the Bruges Kontor was called in the local Flemish dialect, had its own building, its own governance structure, its own set of commercial privileges negotiated with the counts of Flanders, and its own contribution to the complex political life of a city that was simultaneously one of the great centres of cloth production, one of the great centres of international finance, and one of the most hotly contested urban prizes in northern European politics. The rivalry between the Bruges Kontor and the Venetian merchants, who were also major players in the city's commerce, gave the Hanseatic merchants a lesson in the politics of commercial coexistence that they carried with them throughout their history. The Venetians and the Genoese and the other Italian merchants who used Bruges as their northern headquarters were sophisticated, well-connected, and backed by the financial resources of the most advanced commercial civilization in Europe. Competing with them required the Hansa to develop commercial techniques, letters of credit, partnership arrangements, agency relationships, that matched the sophistication of the Mediterranean traders, and the process of this competition drove Hanseatic commercial practice to higher levels of elaboration than it might otherwise have reached. The Bruges Kontor was, in this sense, not just a trading post, but a school of commerce, where the merchants of the north learned to operate in the most competitive commercial environment in the world. The physical world of the Kontor was one of perpetual, carefully organised activity. The counting houses where the merchants worked were full of the smell of parchment and ink and candle wax, the sounds of quills on vellum and the clinking of coin, the low voices of men calculating and negotiating in the particular cadences of commercial German. The warehouses that backed onto the docks were stacked floor to ceiling with goods in various stages of transit, bales of cloth waiting for onward shipment, barrels of salted herring waiting to be opened and inspected, sacks of grain that had survived the sea crossing in better or worse condition and needed to be assessed and priced accordingly. The whole operation ran on information about prices in distant markets, about the availability of goods, about the creditworthiness of trading partners, about the political conditions that might disrupt trade routes. This information was gathered through a network of correspondence maintained by the Kontor's merchants, men in distant cities who wrote regularly with news of market conditions, political developments, and commercial opportunities. The Hanseatic letter, as a genre of commercial communication, is one of the most fascinating artifacts of the medieval commercial world. Terse, practical, packed with specific prices and quantities and names, but occasionally allowing through, in an aside or a parenthetical comment, the human being who was writing, worried about a ship that was overdue, pleased about a particularly good deal, troubled by rumours of political instability that threatened to disrupt the autumn shipments. But it was the Kontor in Novgorod that might most fascinate a modern observer, because it operated at the very edge of the known world as medieval Europeans understood it. Novgorod, in what is now Russia, was in the 13th and 14th centuries one of the great cities of the north. Republic, in fact, governed by a merchant oligarchy and a popular assembly, with traditions of civic autonomy that were sophisticated and ancient. The Hanseatic merchants who established the Peterhof Kontor there, named, with characteristic merchant practicality, after the Saint's Day on which it was traditionally opened each season, were trading in a world profoundly different from anything they knew at home. Beyond Novgorod lay the vast forests of Muscovy, Siberia, and the lands of the northern peoples, and from those forests came the goods that made the Baltic trade so valuable: furs, sable, marten, beaver, ermine. The pelts that European nobility used to line their robes and signal their status, that the church used to decorate its vestments, that every prosperous merchant family aspired to possess. These furs moved from the trappers of the eastern forests into Novgorod, where they were accumulated in the warehouses of the Peterhof, and from there moved westward along. The Hanseatic networked every market in northern Europe and beyond. The Kontor in London, at the Steelyard, which will receive its own full section later in this story, completed the quartet. The 4 Kontors together formed a kind of commercial compass, their 4 points oriented toward the 4 primary commodity zones of the northern economy, and the lines connecting them were the sea lanes of the Hanseatic trade network. Understanding this geography is essential to understanding how the League exercised its power, because the power was geographical before it was anything else. The Hansa did not need to own the land. It needed to control the flows that moved across it, and by positioning its contours at the nodes of those flows, it achieved a kind of leverage that no territorial sovereign could easily match. The rules governing life inside a contour were extraordinary in their detail and their strictness. The Bergen contour, for example, maintained an elaborate hierarchy of merchants and apprentices, the apprentices entering the system as young as 12 or 13, spending years learning the trade under conditions that bordered on the brutal. Initiation rituals at Bergen included being rolled in a barrel, hoisted up a chimney through the smoke, and subjected to various physical tests that served partly as hazing and partly as a genuine assessment of physical toughness, because the life of a merchant in the Bergen contour was physically demanding in ways that are hard to imagine today. The buildings were heated by open fires and were chronically cold. The work involved moving heavy cargoes in all weather. The Norwegian winters were dark and long and far from home, and yet men competed for the positions. Because the rewards of a successful career in the Hanseatic trade were enormous, the network of connections that the League provided was genuinely invaluable, and the security of operating under a recognised legal framework, even one that was foreign and strange to the local population, was worth a great deal in a world where security was never guaranteed. The contour was a hard life, but it was a life with a future, and for a young man from a middling German merchant family, that combination was irresistible. There is a way of looking at the Hanseatic League that reduces it to a series of trade routes and commodity prices, and that way of looking is not wrong, but it misses something crucial. The crucial thing is this: the goods the Hansa traded were not luxuries. They were not exotic spices or silks or rarities that enriched the lives of those who could afford them, while leaving everyone else unchanged. They were staples. They were survival. They were the things that kept populations alive through winters and famines and the recurring crises of subsistence agriculture. And this is what gave the League its extraordinary power. Because when you control the supply of things people cannot live without, you do not need armies. You need ships, warehouses, contracts, and the organisational capacity to turn off the supply when negotiations go badly. The most important commodity in the entire Hanseatic network was not fish, though fish came close. It was grain, rye and wheat from the great agricultural plains of Prussia and Poland, the enormous flat fertile lands east of the Oder River that modern geography knows as the North European Plain, were the food that kept the growing urban populations of the Netherlands, Scandinavia and England alive. The Baltic grain trade was, in the most literal sense, the feeding of a civilization, and it ran almost entirely through Hanseatic hands. The mechanism of this trade is worth understanding in some detail, because it reveals how the League's power worked at its most fundamental level. The grain was grown by Slavic peasants on the estates of the Teutonic Knights and the Polish nobility in Prussia and Poland. It was accumulated in the granary towns along the Vistula River, Thorn, Danzig, Elbing, where Hanseatic merchants had established their trading operations. From there it was loaded onto the great flat-bottomed ships of the Baltic trade and moved westward along the coast through the Sound, the narrow strait, between Denmark and Sweden that was the gateway to the North Sea, and out to the hungry markets of the west. The importance of the Sound cannot be overstated. Every ship that moved between the Baltic and the North Sea had to pass through this narrow channel, and the King of Denmark sat on both sides of it. The tolls that Denmark levied on passing ships, the Sound toll, were one of the primary revenues of the Danish crown for centuries. They were also one of the primary sources of friction between the Hanse and Denmark, and they would eventually become the casus belli for the most dramatic conflict in Hanseatic history. But for most of the League's history, the Sound toll was simply a cost of doing business, an irritant certainly, but a manageable one, built into the price structures that the merchants maintained across their network. The herring fishery was another pillar of the system. Every autumn, enormous shoals of Baltic herring moved into the shallow waters off the Scanian coast, the southern tip of what is now Sweden, which was then Danish territory, and the fishing was so rich that it could be done by anyone with a small boat and the willingness to wade into the cold water. What turned this abundance into a commodity was the preserving and packing industry that the Hanse organised around it. The fish had to be gutted, salted, and packed into barrels in a very specific sequence and with a very specific quality of salt. The grey, coarse salt from the Lüneburg salt works, which was itself a major Hanseatic commodity because its particular chemical composition made it far superior for preserving fish than the salt available anywhere closer to the fishing grounds. The Lübeck merchants who controlled the salt trade from Lüneburg were therefore essential to the herring industry, and the herring industry was essential to feeding the north. This kind of interlocking dependency, where controlling one element of the supply chain gave you leverage over another, was repeated across the Hanseatic network in dozens of variations, each one reinforcing the others. Furs came from the east, from the vast northern forests beyond Novgorod, accumulated through a system of tribute and trade that the Russian princes had organised among the indigenous peoples of Siberia and the far north. The demand for furs was structural and durable. Fur was the primary insulating material available to Europeans before the development of modern textiles, and in the cold climates of northern Europe it was not a luxury but a practical necessity for anyone who could afford it. The wealthier you were, the finer the fur you could afford, and the signal value of wearing fine fur in a society obsessed with visible status markers was enormous. A bishop's ermine-trimmed robe or a duke's sable-lined cloak was not simply warm clothing. It was a statement of position, a costume that communicated social rank in a world where communication of that rank was a constant political necessity. The Hanseatic merchants who moved these furs from Novgorod to Bruges were therefore serving both a practical and a semiotic function. They were supplying warmth, but they were also supplying identity. Timber and naval stores, tar, pitch, hemp for ropes, came primarily from the forests of the Baltic hinterland, from Poland, Lithuania, and the lands of the Teutonic Knights. These commodities were unglamorous but absolutely essential. Without wood and pitch and hemp, the ships that carried all the other trade could not be built or maintained, and this made the Baltic the most strategically important timber supply in Europe. The English wool that was processed in Flemish workshops, the Flemish cloth that was sold across the north, the copper and iron from the Swedish mines at Falun and Sala, all of these moved through the Hanseatic network, each commodity finding its market through the accumulated trust and organisational capacity that the League provided. What is most striking about this system, when you stand back and look at it whole, is how deeply interdependent it was. No single region in northern Europe was self-sufficient. The herring-rich coast of Scania needed the salt from Lüneburg. The grain-surplus lands of Prussia needed the markets of the Netherlands and Norway. Norway needed the grain from Prussia to make up for its own agricultural deficiencies. The Netherlands needed the Baltic grain and timber without which its growing cities would starve and its shipyards would go silent. England needed the Baltic goods for its industries and its navy. All of these needs, all of these flows, converged on the Hanseatic network, and the men who managed that network understood, with a clarity that is breathtaking in retrospect, that this convergence was power. Not the power to take, but the power to withhold. Not the power to conquer, but the power to cut off. The salt trade alone is worth examining in more detail because it illustrates how the Hanse's commercial power worked at its most mechanical level. The salt works at Lüneburg, a city in northern Germany that sits on an enormous underground deposit of rock salt formed by an ancient sea, were among the most important industrial installations in medieval northern Europe. The process of extracting brine and boiling it down to produce salt was energy-intensive and required enormous quantities of wood, which was why the forests around Lüneburg were systematically consumed over the centuries until the city sat in a landscape of remarkable bleakness, its timber resources entirely depleted in service of the salt industry. The salt produced here was grey and coarse by the standards of finer varieties, but it had one quality that made it indispensable for the northern European fish-preserving industry. Its particular chemical composition, with a high magnesium content, made it exceptionally effective at drawing moisture from fish, flesh, and creating the conditions for long-term preservation without imparting the bitter taste that other salts could introduce. This may sound like a minor technical detail, but its commercial significance was enormous. The herring fishery of Scania produced fish in vast quantities, but fish that was not properly salted would spoil within days. Fish that was salted with inferior salt might last longer, but would taste wrong, and in a market where salted herring was a staple consumed by ordinary people who could not afford to be fastidious about quality, a product that tasted wrong would not sell. The Lüneburg salt transported in the heavy barges of the Hanseatic trade down the Elbe and along the coast to the fishing grounds was what made the Scanian herring commercially viable, and the Lübeck merchants who controlled both the salt trade and much of the herring packing industry were therefore extracting profit from both ends of the supply chain, selling the salt to the fishers and packers, and then selling the packed herring to the distributors who would carry it to markets across northern Europe. This kind of vertical integration, controlling multiple stages of the same supply chain, was a recurring feature of the Hanseatic commercial model, and it was one of the primary mechanisms through which the League's member cities accumulated the wealth that funded their political ambitions. The wool trade connected the Hanseatic network to England in ways that deserve elaboration. English wool, particularly the fine, long staple wool produced by the flocks of the Lincolnshire and Yorkshire uplands, was one of the most valued raw materials in medieval Europe, the foundation of the great clothworking industries of the Flemish and Italian cities. The Hanseatic merchants of the Steelyard in London were among the major exporters of this wool, shipping it through the Sound to the workshops of Bruges and Ghent, where it would be woven into the fine, broadcloth that was sold throughout the Mediterranean world. In return, the Flemish cloth industry produced finished textiles that moved back through Hanseatic channels to the north and east. The trade was circular, each stage adding value, each transaction passing through Hanseatic hands, and the cumulative profit from generations of this trade was what built the great merchant houses of Lübeck and Hamburg and gave their owners the financial resources to pursue the political ambitions that the League embodied. The copper trade from Sweden, from the great open-pit mine at Falun in Dalarna, which was already in operation by the 13th century and would continue producing copper until the 20th, is another example of a commodity that was not glamorous but was absolutely essential, and that passed largely through Hanseatic channels. Copper was needed for church bells, for cooking vessels, for the fittings of ships, for the hundreds of applications in a pre-industrial economy that relied on metal but could not always afford the price of iron or bronze. The Swedish copper that moved through the Hanseatic network was processed and distributed across northern Europe in quantities that are still impressive by the standards of pre-modern industry, and the Swedish mining interests that produced it were closely connected to the Hanseatic merchants who organized its distribution. This is the economic theory of the Hanseatic blockade, stated in its simplest form. If you control the flow of goods that peoples and kingdoms cannot live without, you can threaten to stop that flow, and that threat will be more persuasive than any army. The genius of the League was that it built, over 2 centuries of patient commercial expansion, a network so comprehensive and so deeply embedded in the economic life of the North that this threat was entirely credible. And when the threat was not enough, when a king decided to call the merchants bluff, the League demonstrated again and again that it was not bluffing. In the summer of 1361, a Danish king made a decision that would cost him everything and change the history of northern Europe. Valdemar IV Atterdag. The name means New Day or Atonement Day, and he had earned it by restoring Danish power from a period of near total collapse, attacked the island of Gotland, It was not an unprovoked aggression. Valdemar had reasons, political and financial, for wanting to bring Gotland back under Danish control. But the men who were in his way on that island were Hanseatic merchants, and the warehouses they used were Hanseatic property, and the privileges they enjoyed were privileges the League had spent decades negotiating and defending. When Valdemar's forces sacked Visby, the ancient merchant city at Gotland's heart, surrounded by its extraordinary circuit of medieval walls that still stand today, he was not simply taking an island, he was attacking the most fundamental interests of the most powerful commercial organisation in the north. Valdemar was a remarkable figure in his own right, worth understanding on his own terms before examining the conflict that defined his reign's legacy. He had come to the Danish throne in 1340 in circumstances of extreme national humiliation. Denmark had been sold off piecemeal by his predecessors, its provinces mortgaged to German princes, its royal authority a fiction propped up by foreign creditors. Valdemar had spent 20 years patiently reassembling the kingdom, buying back provinces, defeating rivals, rebuilding the administrative machinery of the crown with a systematic intelligence that was unusual for the period. He was not a reckless ruler. He understood very well that the Hanseatic League was the most powerful economic organisation in the Baltic, and he cannot have been unaware that attacking Gotland would provoke a response. What he may have underestimated was the degree to which the League had, over the preceding century, developed both the organisational capacity and the collective will to respond militarily to an attack on its interests. The sack of Visby was, by the standards of 14th century warfare, not unusually brutal, but it was dramatic in its swiftness, and in the completeness with which Valdemar's forces overran the town's defences. The city's walls, those remarkable walls that still encircle the old town today, largely intact after more than 6 centuries, were already ancient by 1361, built over generations by the prosperous Gotlanders to protect their commercial wealth, and they were not enough to stop a determined assault by the Danish forces. The merchants of Visby, both German and Gotlandic, had loaded their most portable valuables onto ships before the attack, but what was left in the warehouses and counting houses was considerable, and Valdemar's treasury benefited substantially from the seizure. Contemporary accounts describe the scene with the kind of detail that comes from genuine witnesses: the burning of buildings, the piling of treasure, the soldiers moving through the city's narrow streets with the casual thoroughness of men who know they will not be interrupted. The League's response was not immediate. Hanseatic decision-making was slow and deliberate, requiring consensus among dozens of independent cities with competing interests. But when it came, it was devastating. The Hansa declared an economic embargo against Denmark. No Hanseatic ship would enter a Danish port, no Hanseatic merchant would trade with Danish customers, no Hanseatic credit would flow to Danish borrowers. This was not a symbolic gesture. Denmark depended on the Hanseatic trade network for goods it could not produce itself, and for the export revenues that kept its royal treasury functioning. Cutting Denmark out of the network was the economic equivalent of a siege, not of a city, but of an entire kingdom. The Danish nobility, which had benefited from the grain trade that moved through Hanseatic channels, felt the pinch almost immediately. The Danish royal household, which had relied on Hanseatic credit for decades, found itself without the financial instruments it needed to function effectively. Even the church, which depended on the preserved fish trade for the observance of its dietary rules, was affected. But Valdemar did not back down. He had not restored Danish power by being easily intimidated, and he had, moreover, the genuine military strength to make his defiance dangerous. He had also, with the strategic intelligence that characterized his rule, been building alliances with other northern powers who had their own reasons to be wary of Hanseatic dominance. Some of the Scandinavian nobility, who resented the League's economic privileges as much as any English merchant, were sympathetic to a king who was willing to stand up to the merchants' collective power. And Valdemar could point with some justification to the fact that the League's commercial privileges were a distortion of the natural order of sovereign power, that no group of merchants should be able to dictate terms to a king in his own domain. The League needed to move beyond economic pressure to direct conflict, and this required assembling something it had never assembled before on this scale: a full war fleet. The Hanseatic cities agreed to contribute ships in proportion to their size and wealth, converting their merchant vessels, the great tubby single-masted cogs of the Baltic trade, into warships by adding fighting platforms and loading them with soldiers. Lübeck provided the largest contingent, but Hamburg, Wismar, Rostock, Stralsund, and the other major cities all contributed, and the cities of Prussia and the Eastern Baltic, who had their own grievances with Danish commercial policy, sent their ships as well. The resulting fleet, assembled over the course of several years in the early 1360s, was one of the largest naval forces the medieval Baltic had ever seen. Dozens of ships, hundreds of soldiers, thousands of sailors, all funded by the accumulated commercial wealth of the League's member cities. The war that followed was brutal, expensive, and prolonged. It lasted in various phases from the early 1360s until 1370, and it drew in not just the Hansa and Denmark but the various Scandinavian kingdoms, Sweden, Norway, whose interests were entangled with the question of Danish power in the Baltic. There were naval battles in which the merchant-turned warships of the League grappled with the Danish fleet in the cold waters of the Belt and the Sound. There were sieges of Danish coastal towns conducted by Hanseatic soldiers fighting not for conquest, but for the restoration of commercial rights. There were diplomatic negotiations that collapsed, resumed, collapsed again, as each side tested the other's endurance, and throughout all of this the economic embargo continued squeezing Denmark's trade revenues and its ability to sustain the war effort. Valdemar's personal response to the conflict was complicated by the practical difficulty of fighting a war against an enemy that had no territory to seize and no capital to besiege. You could not defeat the Hanseatic League by capturing Lübeck. Lübeck was one node in a network, and the network would continue to function without it. You could not force the League to terms by defeating it in a single great battle. The League's power was commercial, not military, and its ability to sustain an embargo was not diminished by military reverses in the field. This is the peculiar strategic challenge that the Hansa presented to any adversary. It was a distributed system, resilient to the kinds of concentrated force that conventional military strategy was designed to apply, and defeating it required either a sustained and comprehensive military effort that no medieval kingdom could afford, or a negotiated settlement that acknowledged the League's power. What ultimately broke Denmark was not a single decisive battle, but the accumulated weight of economic suffocation combined with military pressure. The embargo that the Hansa maintained throughout the conflict denied Denmark the revenues and the goods it needed to sustain the war effort. The military operations, though never conclusive in the sense of knocking Denmark out entirely, kept the pressure on and prevented Valdemar from finding the breathing room he needed. And in the background, the League's network of alliances with Danish rivals, particularly Sweden, ensured that Denmark could not concentrate its strength against the merchants alone. Valdemar found himself fighting a war on multiple fronts against adversaries he could not easily defeat, funded by revenues he could not easily replenish, sustained by credit he could not easily access. The Treaty of Stralsund, signed in 1370, was the outcome, and it was one of the most extraordinary documents in medieval commercial history. Its terms gave the Hanseatic League something that no merchant organisation had ever achieved before, and would never quite achieve again: direct political control over the mechanism of Danish royal succession. The treaty stipulated that before the next Danish king could take the throne, his candidacy had to be approved by the Hanseatic cities. This was not a commercial concession. This was sovereignty, the power to determine who ruled a kingdom, extracted from a defeated king by merchants through the instrument of economic and military power, on terms that the king had no realistic choice but to accept. Beyond this extraordinary political gain, the treaty restored and expanded the commercial privileges the League had held before the war, confirmed Hanseatic control of 4 Danish castles along the Sound for 15 years, giving the merchants physical control of the most strategically important waterway in the Baltic, and established the principle, it would never quite be forgotten, that challenging the Hanseatic network's commercial rights was a dangerous game. The 4 castles were, in practical terms, the keys to the Sound. Whoever garrisoned them controlled the passage between the Baltic and the North Sea, and the Hansa held them for 15 years as a kind of commercial mortgage, ensuring that Denmark could not again attempt to close the Baltic without first dislodging the merchants from fortifications they had legally occupied. Valdemar IV, who had been one of the most formidable rulers Denmark had produced in a century, died in 1375, still unable to fully undo the humiliation of Stralsund. He had restored Denmark from near dissolution had won back its provinces and rebuilt its institutions, and had then seen his greatest achievement, the reassertion of Danish sovereignty in the Baltic, reversed by a coalition of merchants who had neither the divine right of kings nor the chivalric legitimacy of noble warriors, but who possessed, in their network and their discipline and their accumulated commercial wealth, a form of power that the political theory of the 14th century had no adequate words for. The League had demonstrated to anyone in Northern Europe paying attention that it could do what it had threatened, cut off a kingdom and bring it to its knees. The lesson was absorbed, and it was not forgotten. The Stralsund victory had a transformative effect on the League's internal cohesion, as well as its external power. Before the war, the Hanse's unity had always been somewhat theoretical, an agreement to cooperate that was repeatedly strained by the competing interests of its member cities. The successful prosecution of a war, the achievement of a treaty that gave all members genuine gains, the shared experience of collective action, producing results that no individual city could have achieved alone, all of this strengthened the bonds that held the League together. The years immediately following Stralsund were in some ways the League's high watermark, the period of greatest power, greatest cohesion, and greatest prestige. But high watermarks are, by definition, followed by ebb. The forces that would eventually erode the League's dominance were already beginning to stir, even in the moment of triumph. The national states of Northern Europe were slowly consolidating power, developing the administrative and military capacity to challenge corporate privileges that earlier rulers had been too weak to contest. The commercial geography of Europe was shifting, as new trade routes opened and old ones declined. And the League itself, that vast, unwieldy, consensus-driven confederation of 200-odd cities, was beginning to show the strains of its own success, pulled in different directions by the competing interests of its members. None of this was visible in 1370. What was visible was the fleet returning to Lübeck harbour, the treaty signed and sealed, the Danish castles garrisoned by Hanseatic soldiers, and the merchants of a dozen cities doing the calculations that showed how much they had gained. It was a moment of extraordinary collective achievement, and the men who had achieved it had every reason to savour it. There is a ship sitting in the Harbour Museum in Bremen that was pulled from the mud of the Weser River in 1962, and it is, quite literally, the ship that built an empire. It is a Hanseatic cog, specifically the Bremen cog, dated to around 1380, one of the most extraordinarily preserved medieval vessels ever recovered, and when you stand beside it in the museum you can see immediately why it was the dominant merchant vessel of the Baltic for 2 centuries. It is not beautiful in the sleek, sharp prowed way of a warship, or the elegant way of a later caravel or galleon. It is beautiful in a purely functional way, wide, deep-bellied, flat-bottomed in the Baltic sections with a single, large square sail and a stern rudder that replaced the older steering oar, and a cargo capacity that made everything the Vikings had sailed look like a rowboat. The cog could carry 200 or more tons of cargo in a single voyage, crewed by a dozen men in waters that earlier generations had considered impassable for vessels of that size. The cog was a technological revolution, though the revolution happened so gradually, over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, that no one who lived through it would have described it that way. The key innovations were simple, but transformative. The Carvel-built hull, which was stronger and more watertight than the earlier clinker construction. The centerline stern rudder, which allowed far greater control than the steering oar and made the ship manageable in a broader range of wind conditions. And the single large square sail, which captured enough wind to drive the laden vessel's considerable weight. These innovations combined to create a ship that could carry more cargo, farther, with fewer crew, than anything the Baltic had previously seen, and the merchants who adopted it earliest, the German merchants of Lübeck and Hamburg and the other rising Baltic cities, gained a significant competitive advantage that they parlayed into commercial dominance. The same qualities that made the cog an excellent merchant vessel also made it, with modifications, an adequate warship, or at least adequate for the kind of naval warfare that the medieval Baltic required. Medieval naval combat was not the sophisticated range-based artillery duel of later centuries. It was, for the most part, ship-to-ship grappling, getting close enough to the enemy vessel to throw grappling hooks, haul the ships together, and then fight it out hand-to-hand on the decks. For this kind of combat, the cog's high sides were actually an advantage. Defenders fighting from an elevated position had a significant edge over attackers trying to board from lower vessels, and the cog, with its flat bottom and deep belly, rode high in the water even when laden. The League's practice of adding wooden fighting castles, raised platforms at the bow and stern from which archers and soldiers could fire down on enemy vessels, turned the merchant cog into something that could hold its own in most naval engagements. The assembly of a Hanseatic war fleet was a logistical and diplomatic achievement of the First Order. The League had no permanent navy. Maintaining one would have been enormously expensive and politically complicated, given that the cities were independent entities, each responsible for their own defence. Instead, when military action was required, the Diet, the General Assembly of the League, voted an assessment on each member city, specifying how many ships and men each was required to contribute based on its size and wealth. Lübeck, as the largest and most powerful city, contributed the most. Smaller cities contributed proportionally less, sometimes combining their contributions with neighbours to meet the assessment collectively. The resulting fleet was heterogeneous, ships of different sizes and capabilities, crews of different training and experience, but it was large, and in the Baltic of the 14th and 15th centuries, size was what mattered most. The League's relationship with piracy was complicated in ways that reveal a great deal about how medieval commercial law actually worked. The most famous pirates of the Baltic were the Vitalienbrüder, the Victual Brothers, a loosely organised band of privateers who operated in the late 14th century, initially with the blessing and support of the Hanseatic cities of Mecklenburg and Rostock, who hired them to supply the besieged Stockholm with food during a Swedish civil war. When the war ended, the Vitalienbrüder did not disband. They continued raiding, turning their attention to Hanseatic shipping with cheerful impartiality, and the League was forced to mount a major naval campaign to suppress them, eventually hunting down and executing their most notorious leaders, including the legendary Klaus Störtebeker in Hamburg in 1401. Störtebeker became a figure of folklore almost immediately after his death, with stories attaching themselves to him that were partly admiring. He was said to have mounted such a generous table for his crew that his ship's mast was hollowed out and filled with gold, hidden there for distribution among his men, and partly terrifying. His legend persisted for centuries, transforming in folk memory from a dangerous criminal into something closer to a Baltic Robin Hood, which is perhaps the inevitable fate of any pirate spectacular enough to require a military campaign for his defeat. The naval dimension of Hanseatic power is often underappreciated because the League is primarily understood as a commercial organisation, but the capacity for military action, demonstrated at Stralsund, demonstrated against the Vitalienbrüder, demonstrated in a series of conflicts with pirates, rival cities, and resentful sovereigns throughout the League's history, was what made the commercial privileges real. A merchant network that cannot defend itself is a network that depends entirely on the goodwill of the powers surrounding it, and goodwill is an unreliable foundation for a commercial empire. The Hanse's willingness and ability to deploy force, however reluctantly and expensively, was the thing that kept its privileges from being abstract pieces of paper. The suppression of the Vitalienbrüder was itself a remarkable operation, conducted over years rather than months, requiring coordination among multiple Hanseatic cities and the willingness to commit significant resources to what was essentially a policing operation rather than a war of defence. The Vitalienbrüder at their height operated across the entire Western Baltic, raiding not just individual ships but harbours and coastal settlements, and they had turned the waters between Hamburg and Lübeck, the most commercially vital route in the entire Hanseatic network, into a zone of danger that was costing the League's members enormous sums in lost cargoes and delayed shipments. The decision to mount a systematic military campaign against them, rather than simply accepting piracy as a cost of doing business, reflected the League's evolved understanding of itself as a sovereign-like entity responsible for the safety of its commercial domain. Klaus Störtebeker's execution in Hamburg in 1401 was, according to the chroniclers who recorded it, a spectacle that drew enormous crowds. He was reportedly beheaded, and the legends that attached themselves to his death began almost immediately. That he had made a bargain with the executioner, that any of his crewmen he could walk past after his head was removed would go free, and that his headless body actually managed several steps before the executioner tripped him. That the Hamburg authorities, furious at this implicit acknowledgement of his supernatural toughness, staked his severed head on a pole with 71 of his crew members' heads in a grim row along the harbour, Whether these stories are true hardly matters. They tell us something about the impression Störtebeker made on his contemporaries, a figure of such audacious and violent competence that even in death he generated legends. The Hanse's willingness to hunt him down and execute him publicly was a statement of institutional seriousness. The League was not simply a commercial organisation. It was a political authority, and like any political authority, it reserved to itself the right to administer justice within its domain. That right was asserted not through legal theory, but through the practical demonstration that the League had both the power and the will to pursue those who violated it, across open water and over the protests of the petty lordlings who had occasionally sheltered the pirates for a cut of their takings. Walk along the north bank of the Thames today, somewhere between London Bridge and Cannon Street Station, and you're walking over ground that was once the most exclusive patch of foreign real estate in England. The Steelyard, the English rendering of Stahlhof, meaning sample court or possibly derived from a weighing yard where steel was measured, was the Hanseatic contour in London, and it occupied a privileged enclave on the riverbank that the German merchants had inhabited since at least the 13th century. It was not a large territory, perhaps half a hectare of warehouses, living quarters, a great hall, a weighing house, a chapel. But within its walls the merchants of the Hanseatic League lived under German law, conducted their business under their own governance, and enjoyed commercial privileges that made English wool traders livid with envy for 2.5 centuries. The privileges were extraordinary, and they had been accumulated, one negotiation at a time, over the course of a relationship between the English crown and the Hanseatic merchants that stretched back to at least the 13th century. At the height of their influence, the Steelyard merchants paid lower customs duties than English merchants on goods moving in and out of England. They had the right to trade freely throughout England without paying the local market fees that native traders were subject to. They could seal their own goods with their own seal. They governed themselves under their own aldermen, their disputes settled by their own internal processes rather than by English courts in the first instance. They were, in a very literal sense, a state within a state, and the English political establishment was deeply, persistently, bitterly aware of this fact. The reason English kings granted these extraordinary privileges is simple, and it says something important about the nature of power in the medieval period. They needed the money. The Hanseatic merchants were among the most reliable financiers available to the English crown in the 13th and 14th centuries, their credit networks and accumulated wealth making them natural lenders to a monarchy that was almost perpetually broke. Edward I borrowed from the Hanseatic merchants to finance his wars in Scotland and France. Later, English kings continued the relationship, each one renewing and often extending the Steelyard's privileges in exchange for the financial support that the merchants could provide. The merchants, for their part, were happy to lend money to kings, not out of generosity but because each loan came with a quid pro quo, another layer of privilege, another commercial advantage built into the terms of repayment. It was a kind of long-term investment in regulatory capture that the Hanse practiced with remarkable consistency wherever it operated. The English merchants who watched all of this with helpless fury were not wrong that they were being disadvantaged. The differential in customs duties alone put English wool exporters at a significant competitive disadvantage when competing with Hanseatic merchants for the same business, and the additional privileges, the freedom from local market fees, the self-governance, the sealed goods, compounded the problem. English merchants petitioned Parliament repeatedly to have the privileges curtailed, and Parliament obligingly passed resolutions and acts that, in theory, reduced or eliminated some of them. In practice, the Crown almost always found reasons to ignore or overturn these acts when the financial pressure became too great. The German merchants, their money and their commercial network too valuable to lose, continued to enjoy their privileges long after political theory had turned decisively against the idea of a foreign corporate body operating under its own law within English territory. The social world of the Steelyard was a remarkable thing, sealed off from the teeming life of London, that surrounded it yet somehow in the middle of everything. The merchants who lived there were not recluses. They patronised London's taverns and markets and hired English labour for various tasks. But they maintained a careful distance from the English community that was both social custom and commercial strategy. The Conter's rules about fraternisation and marriage were enforced, though perhaps with less severity than at Bergen, simply because London was a far more sophisticated and seductive environment than the Norwegian coast. The merchants who spent years in the Steelyard were men of the world in a way that their counterparts in Bergen rarely became. They spoke English, they understood English politics, They had relationships with English nobles and London merchants that were not purely transactional, but they remained, in their own understanding and in that of the League's rules, German merchants operating a German institution in a foreign city. The buildings they left behind have not survived. The Steelyard was demolished in stages over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. The final buildings going when the South approach to Cannon Street railway station was built in the Victorian era, but contemporary descriptions and a few surviving images give a sense of what it looked like. The main hall was large enough to serve as a venue for significant entertainments. Hans Holbein the Younger, the great German portraitist who spent much of his career in England, was commissioned to paint decorative murals for it, and he also painted portraits of several of the Steelyard's merchants, some of which survive and are among the finest portraits of 16th century mercantile figures anywhere in existence. There is something in these portraits that captures something essential about the men who built the Hanseatic world. They look out from the canvas with a directness and an intelligence that is unmistakable, men who are aware of their own importance and quietly confident of their place in the world, neither ostentatious nor modest, simply present. The Steelyard would endure, in various states of privilege and conflict, until 1598, when Elizabeth I finally expelled the Hanseatic merchants from England in retaliation for what she saw as unfair competition with English merchants in the Baltic. By that point, the League was already in serious decline, and the Steelyard's closure was as much a symptom as a cause of that decline. But for most of its history, from the 13th century to the late 16th, it stood as perhaps the most audacious expression of Hanseatic power, a community of foreign merchants governing themselves by their own law in the capital city of a major European kingdom under privileges that no other foreign body in England's history has ever quite matched. There is a word in the old German of the Hanseatic merchants, Ungeld, that roughly translates as unjust payment or illegitimate toll, and it was used to describe the fees and levies that local authorities attempted to extract from merchants who were supposed to be exempt from such charges under their commercial privileges. The Hanseatic merchant who used this word was not simply complaining. He was invoking a legal concept, a claim that the levy in question violated a specific treaty obligation, and he was doing so in the expectation that the League would take up his case and pursue it through whatever channels, diplomatic, commercial, military, were available. This sense of entitlement, the absolute confidence that commercial rights, once negotiated, were real and enforceable, is one of the most striking features of the Hanseatic merchant mentality, and nowhere was it more tested than in Novgorod. The Peterhof contour at Novgorod was, in many ways, the most extreme version of the Hanseatic experiment in self-contained mercantile sovereignty. Novgorod was not simply a different city. In a different country, it was a different civilization. The language was incomprehensible, the script illegible, the religious practices alien. Novgorod was Orthodox Christian with all the theological and liturgical differences that implied, the legal customs radically unlike anything the German merchants knew, and the political structure, a merchant republic governed by an assembly of free citizens, with an elected prince serving as military commander but no legislative power, both familiar in broad outline and profoundly different in detail. The German merchants who staffed the Peterhof were operating at the edge of the world their culture recognized, and they knew it. The goods that passed through the Peterhof were worth the difficulty. Furs have already been mentioned, but the Novgorod trade was more diverse than that. Wax, used in vast quantities for church candles throughout Catholic Europe, and therefore in permanent demand. Honey, which served as both a food and the primary sweetener in a world without cheap sugar. Leather and hides from the cattle-raising regions east of Novgorod, and the occasional extraordinary rarity, amber from the Baltic coast, which moved both east and west through Novgorod's markets. Walrus ivory from the far north, traded down through indigenous networks to the city's markets, and the scattered products of a vast hinterland that European merchants were only beginning to understand. The Peterhof operated under rules that were even stricter than the Bergen contour in some respects, because the stakes of a commercial dispute in Novgorod were higher. Novgorodian merchants and political authorities were perfectly capable of seizing German goods, imprisoning German merchants, or simply refusing to honour agreements when it suited them, not out of malice, but because the legal frameworks of the two cultures did not align neatly, and disputes about what had actually been agreed were genuinely difficult to resolve. The League's response to this uncertainty was characteristically systematic. It documented everything, maintained its own records of every transaction and every agreement, and trained its merchants to operate within the Peterhof's protective rules with an absoluteness that sometimes made commercial sense difficult to achieve. The relationship between the League and Novgorod had a rhythm of crisis and reconciliation that stretched over more than 2 centuries. When Novgorodian merchants or authorities violated what the League considered its rights, the Hansa responded with an embargo, refusing to trade, closing the Peterhof, withdrawing its merchants. These embargoes were effective because Novgorod needed the access to Western markets that the League provided, just as the League needed access to the Eastern commodities that Novgorod controlled. The mutual dependency was real, and both sides knew it, which meant that embargoes rarely lasted long but were deployed repeatedly as the primary instrument of negotiation. The end of the Peterhof came not from any commercial failure or any successful Hanseatic policy, but from a geopolitical transformation entirely outside the League's control. Even the Third of Moscow, even the Great, as he would be remembered, conquered Novgorod in 1478, ending the Republic and absorbing it into the expanding Muscovite state. In 1494, 16 years later, he ordered the Peterhof closed, its merchants expelled, and its goods confiscated. The reasons were partly political. Ivan was consolidating Muscovite sovereignty and had no patience for foreign corporate bodies operating under their own laws on Russian soil, and partly commercial, as the Muscovite state was developing its own ideas about how trade should be organized and controlled. For the League, it was a devastating blow. The eastern anchor of the network had been pulled out, and the trade in furs and wax and Russian goods would never again flow as smoothly through. Hanseatic hands. The closure of the Peterhof was not quite the end of Hanseatic involvement in the Russian trade. Riga and Reval, the great Hanseatic cities of the eastern Baltic, continued to serve as intermediaries between the Muscovite interior and the western markets for another century and more, but it marked the beginning of a process by which the League's eastern network was slowly dismantled, pushed back and compressed by the consolidating power of states that had no interest in maintaining the extraordinary privileges the merchants had accumulated during the centuries of political fragmentation. The world that had made the Peterhof possible was passing away, and the merchants could do nothing to stop it. The mystery at the heart of the Hanseatic League, the thing that most perplexed contemporary observers and continues to fascinate historians, is how it functioned at all. 200 cities, stretching from the Zuiderzee to the Gulf of Finland, speaking different dialects, governed by different constitutions, dominated by different interests, with no common sovereign, no permanent executive, no standing army, no common treasury, and no mechanism for enforcing compliance beyond the threat of expulsion from the network. How did this collection of self-interested urban republics manage to act in concert often enough and decisively enough to bring kings to their knees? The answer lies in an institution called the Hanseatic, the Hanseatic Diet, or General Assembly, and in the particular genius of the commercial elite that ran it. The Diet met when it met in Lübeck, which was both the League's acknowledged leader and its administrative centre. When it met is an important qualification. The Diet was not a regularly scheduled institution. It was convened by Lübeck when circumstances demanded, and it met only when enough member cities could be persuaded to send representatives. For much of the League's history, attendance at any given Diet was thin, dominated by the Wendish cities Lübeck, Hamburg, Wismar, Rostock, Stralsund, Lüneburg, that were geographically close and historically central to the network, with the more distant cities like Danzig, Riga and Cologne sending representatives less consistently and sometimes not at all. Decision-making at the Diet required consensus, not a formal majority vote, but a general agreement among those present that a course of action was acceptable. This is, from the perspective of modern organisational theory, extraordinarily cumbersome and inefficient. It meant that decisions could be blocked by any sufficiently important member, that negotiations within the Diet itself were often as complicated as negotiations with external powers, and that the League could very rarely move quickly. Against these disadvantages, the consensus requirement offered one enormous advantage. Decisions that were reached were genuinely supported by those who had made them, and cities that had agreed to a course of action had genuinely binding reasons to follow through. The role of Lübeck in all of this was central but never quite hegemonic. Lübeck was first among equals, a phrase that in practice meant that it took the lead in organising diets, drafting positions, negotiating with external powers, and enforcing League decisions through the threat of exclusion. But it was not a sovereign over the other cities and could not simply command them. When Lübeck's interests aligned with those of the majority of member cities, the League was powerful and decisive. When Lübeck's interests diverged from those of important members, as happened with increasing frequency in the 15th and 16th centuries, as the interests of the eastern cities like Danzig and Riga began to diverge significantly from those of the western cities, the League's coherence frayed. The tool of enforcement available to the League against recalcitrant members was called Verhansung, exclusion from the Hansa, a city that violated League agreements, that traded with those the League had embargoed, that failed to meet its assessed contributions to collective military actions, could be excluded from the network. Its merchants would lose access to the League's trading privileges. Its ships would be refused in Hanseatic ports. Its goods would not be accepted by Hanseatic merchants. This was a serious punishment, because the commercial benefits of League membership were real and substantial. But it was a punishment the League was always reluctant to deploy against important members, because expelling a large city reduced the League's own power along with it. The threat of Verhansung was most credible against small, economically peripheral members, the cities that needed the League more than the League needed them, and least credible against the great trading cities like Danzig or Hamburg or Cologne, whose exclusion would have damaged the network as much as, or more than, their defection. This structural weakness, the difficulty of disciplining powerful members, became increasingly important as the League aged and the political landscape around it changed. In the 15th century, the interests of the eastern Hanseatic cities, dominated by the grain trade of the Baltic hinterland, diverged sharply from those of the western cities, more oriented toward the cloth and textile trades of the Low Countries. The eastern cities wanted to maintain good relations with Poland and Lithuania, the great agricultural powers of their hinterland. The western cities wanted to maintain the privileges in Bruges and the Low Countries trade. These diverging interests produced, within the Diet, the kind of paralysis that the consensus requirement was specifically designed to avoid, but sometimes specifically produced. The men who navigated this internal politics, the syndics and aldermen and merchant oligarchs who dominated the governance of Hanseatic cities, were a remarkable class of operators. They were not intellectuals or theorists. They were practical men, trained in the details of commerce, skilled in the arts of negotiation, and possessed of a collective memory, passed down through merchant families over generations, of what the League had achieved and what it had failed to achieve. The great Hanseatic families, the Murmasters of Lübeck, the Morenbergs of Hamburg, the Ferbers of Danzig, built their political power on their commercial networks and sustained it through judicious alliance-making, careful management of civic institutions, and the cultivation of a reputation for reliability that was, in a world without limited liability or bankruptcy protection, the most valuable asset a commercial family could possess. When a Lübeck merchant family gave its word, other merchants knew that the word would be kept, because the alternative, defaulting on an obligation, breaking a contract, violating a trust, would destroy the family's reputation and with it their access to the credit networks that were the foundation of their wealth. The physical act of attending a Hanseatic diet was itself a significant undertaking that reveals something about the seriousness with which the League's governance was taken. Delegates from Danzig or Riga might travel for weeks to reach Lübeck, through weather that was unreliable at best and genuinely dangerous at worst, by road and river and coastal ship, representing their city's interests in negotiations that might last weeks or months. They brought written instructions from their city councils, carefully drafted documents specifying what the city was willing to agree to, what it would oppose, and under what circumstances it might be persuaded to shift position. These instructions were not suggestions. They were mandates, and a delegate who agreed to something beyond what his instructions authorized could face serious consequences on his return home. The rigidity this imposed on the Diet's deliberations was one of the sources of the League's frustrating slowness in decision-making, but it was also one of the guarantees of the League's legitimacy. No city could be bound by an agreement it had not explicitly authorized, and this meant that agreements reached at the Diet had genuine authority behind them. This informal but powerful enforcement mechanism was, in many ways, the truest foundation of the Hanseatic system. The League had no court with jurisdiction over its members, no executive with power to compel compliance, no standing force with authority to act. What it had was reputation, the accumulated credibility of an institution that, over centuries, had generally done what it said it would do, had honoured the agreements it made, had supported its members when they were attacked, and excluded those who violated its rules. This credibility was not created by any single act or any single institution. It was the product of thousands of individual decisions made by thousands of individual merchants and civic officials, each choosing to honour their obligations when they might plausibly have evaded them, because they understood, as all participants in a long-running cooperative enterprise must eventually understand, that the institution's value depended on the general expectation that its members would behave reliably. Betray that expectation once, and you might gain an advantage. Betray it consistently, and you destroyed the thing that gave all the advantages their value in the first place. There is a moment in every great institution's history when the forces that created it begin to work against it, when the very success that built the organization generates the conditions for its eventual dissolution. For the Hanseatic League, this moment came gradually, over the course of the 15th century, and it came from three directions simultaneously: the consolidation of the nation-states of Northern Europe, the emergence of new commercial competitors, and the transformation of the global trading system that followed from European contact with the Americas and the establishment of direct sea routes to Asia. The nation-states were the most immediate threat, and they struck at the most fundamental premise on which the League had always operated. The Hanse's power depended on the political fragmentation of the North. It needed kings who were too weak or too dependent on Hanseatic finance to revoke the merchants' privileges, too divided in their attention to develop alternative commercial networks, too ignorant of economic organization to build their own trading institutions. The kings of the 12th and 13th centuries fit this description almost perfectly. The kings of the 15th and 16th centuries did not. England under Edward IV began the process in the 1460s with a series of measures designed to reduce Hanseatic privilege and expand opportunities for English merchants. Edward's motivations were partly commercial. He was himself a significant investor in foreign trade and understood the mechanics of commercial competition in a way that his predecessors had not. And partly political, responding to sustained pressure from the English merchant community, which had been lobbying against Hanseatic privileges for 2 centuries. The process was halting and incomplete, repeatedly interrupted by the political turbulences of the Wars of the Roses and the financial pressures that kept driving English kings back to Hanseatic credit. But the direction was clear. English sovereigns were increasingly inclined to see the Steelyards' privileges as an anomaly to be corrected rather than an arrangement to be maintained. The Dutch were the most economically significant new competitor, and they were devastating in a way that no military opponent could have been. The rise of Dutch commercial power in the late 15th and early 16th centuries was built on a series of innovations in shipbuilding, navigation, and commercial organization that the Hanseatic cities proved unable or unwilling to match. The Dutch Fluit, a ship that emerged in the late 16th century as a successor to the cog, was faster, cheaper to build, more capacious relative to its crew size, and more versatile than anything the Hanseatic fleet could offer. Dutch merchants, operating through a commercial culture that was itself undergoing the transformation that would eventually produce the Dutch East India Company, began penetrating the Baltic trade on terms that the Hanse's established merchants found increasingly difficult to match. The herring fishery, previously a Hanseatic near monopoly, was lost to Dutch fishermen in the late 14th century, when the herring shoals mysteriously shifted from the Scanian coast to the North Sea, an ecological event of enormous commercial consequence that transferred one of the League's most valuable monopolies into Dutch hands at a stroke. The Dutch advantage was not simply technological, it was also organisational and cultural. Dutch merchants operated with a flexibility and a willingness to accept lower margins on high volume that the Hanseatic merchant establishment, accustomed to the profits that came from near-monopoly control of key routes and commodities, found genuinely alien. Where a Hanseatic merchant in Bergen expected to maintain prices at a certain level because the League's control of the trade gave him pricing power, a Dutch merchant was willing to cut prices, to accept slimmer margins, to compete aggressively on terms that the older commercial traditions of the Hanse had never had to accommodate. This is, in essence, the story of the disruption of every established commercial order by more aggressive new competitors. The incumbents have optimized for the world as it was, and the newcomers have optimized for the world as it is becoming. The commercial geography of the Baltic was also shifting in ways that disadvantaged the Western Hanseatic cities. The rise of Danzig as the dominant grain exporting city of the Eastern Baltic, which occurred over the course of the 15th century, as the great agricultural estates of Prussia and Poland increasingly channeled their exports through this single hub. Both created an enormously profitable trade and concentrated it in ways that reduced the relevance of the smaller cities that had previously participated more equally in the grain trade's profits. Danzig's interests increasingly diverged from those of Lübeck. The eastern city wanted to maintain good relations with Poland, its agricultural hinterland, even when that required compromising on the rigid Hanseatic trading rules that Lübeck tried to maintain as matters of principle. The internal tensions this created, between Eastern pragmatism and Western orthodoxy, between cities whose fortunes were rising and cities whose fortunes were declining, were a constant drain on the collective energy the League needed to face its external challenges. The shift in the herring grounds was a gift that the Dutch exploited with characteristic efficiency. They developed the bus ship, a specialized herring vessel that could gut, salt and barrel fish at sea, eliminating the need to bring the catch ashore for processing and dramatically reducing the costs of the operation. The Hanseatic cities that had built their prosperity on the Scanian fishery were left with processing infrastructure and distribution networks oriented toward a fishery that no longer existed where they had always fished it. The Dutch, unencumbered by existing investments, could simply follow the fish and build the new infrastructure on the North Sea coast. This is the economic story of the League's decline in miniature. An organisation optimised for one world found itself unable to adapt when that world changed. The opening of direct sea routes to Asia around the Cape of Good Hope, Vasco da Gama's voyage reaching India in 1498, was a longer-term but ultimately more fundamental disruption. The Hanseatic network had derived significant value from its position as a node in the overland and Baltic sea routes along which eastern goods moved from the Mediterranean to northern Europe. The spices, silks, and other eastern goods that entered Europe through Venice and Genoa eventually found their way to northern markets partly through Hanseatic channels. When the Portuguese and then the Dutch established direct maritime routes that bypassed the overland routes entirely, the structure of European long-distance trade was reorganized in ways that systematically reduced the value of the intermediary position the Hanse occupied. The center of gravity of European commerce shifted from the Baltic and the North Sea toward the Atlantic, and the Hanseatic cities, with the exception of Hamburg, which was well positioned to participate in the Atlantic trade, were left on the periphery of the new commercial geography. The Swedish Empire's rise in the 17th century completed the political encirclement. Sweden under Gustavus Adolphus and his successors established control over the southern coast of the Baltic, the old Hanseatic heartland, with a thoroughness that left no room for the kind of political vacuum in which the League's privileges had flourished. The great Hanseatic cities of the eastern Baltic, Riga, Reval, Narva, found themselves inside Swedish territory, their relationship to the League complicated by the need to accommodate their new sovereign. Hamburg and Bremen, on the western edge of the network, survived and eventually thrived precisely because they were far enough from the centres of Baltic power to maintain meaningful autonomy, but they were not the Hanse. They were successor states to it, carrying its traditions into a world where the organisation itself had ceased to function. The 16th century was the century of the League's long goodbye, drawn out over decades of diminishing power, contested privileges, and the increasing inability to concert collective action among member cities whose divergent interests had become too great to bridge. There were still Hanseatic diets, still negotiations, still the occasional collective commercial action. There were even still wars, but the wars of the 16th century were fought defensively, trying to hold what remained rather than expand, and the results were increasingly mixed. The most significant military engagement of the League's later period was the conflict known as the Count's War, the Greve Fide, which consumed Denmark between 1534 and 1536, drawing in Hanseatic forces in support of Christian III of Denmark against a faction that had allied itself with Lübeck. The political details are complex, and the Danish dynastic politics involved are Byzantine even by the standards of 16th century Scandinavian statecraft. What matters for the Hanse's story is that Lübeck committed enormous resources to this war and lost. The defeat fundamentally damaged Lübeck's position as the League's dominant city and revealed, with painful clarity, how much the political and military landscape had changed since the great triumph of Stralsund a century and a half earlier. Lübeck's mayor during this period was Jürgen Wollenweber, a figure whose brief dramatic career encapsulates something about the desperate quality of the League's attempts to maintain its position in a world that was moving past it. Wollenweber was not a member of the traditional merchant oligarchy that had governed Lübeck for generations. He was a populist figure, riding a wave of civic discontent to power, and he pursued an aggressive foreign policy that the traditional merchant establishment would never have countenanced, allying Lübeck with factions in Denmark and Sweden, committing to wars on multiple fronts, simultaneously gambling the city's resources on outcomes that never materialized as he had projected. When the Count's War ended badly, Wollenweber was deposed, arrested, tortured, and executed in 1537 on charges that were partly political and partly genuine. He had, in his desperation, made choices that were genuinely reckless by any standard. His fate reads, across 5 centuries, as the fate of a man who understood that the League was losing but lacked the strategic resources to reverse a structural decline, and who gambled desperately in the absence of a viable strategic alternative. After Wollenweber, Lübeck retreated to a more cautious posture, and the League contracted around it. Cities that had been members in the 14th century quietly stopped attending diets, stopped meeting their obligations, stopped thinking of themselves as Hanseatic. The network's physical extent shrank, the community of active participants diminished, and the shared identity that had once connected 200 cities across Northern Europe became increasingly theoretical. The commercial infrastructure, however, persisted longer than the political identity. Hanseatic merchants continued to operate in the Baltic and North Seas long after the League's formal structure had ceased to function effectively. The habits of commercial cooperation, the networks of credit and information, the family relationships that connected merchant dynasties across the League's former territory, all of these persisted because they were genuinely valuable, and the men who benefited from them had no particular reason to abandon them, simply because the political organization that had originally created them was collapsing. The final Hanseatic Diet met in 1669, a gathering so attenuated that only 9 cities participated, 3 of which, Lübeck, Hamburg and Bremen, were doing most of the work. The Diet resolved various practical matters, debated the perpetual problems of piracy and commercial privilege, and then, without formally dissolving itself, there was no mechanism for formal dissolution, the League having never formally constituted itself in the first place, simply failed to meet again. The last Diet of 1669 is conventionally treated as the end of the Hanseatic League, but it is an end without drama, without a decisive battle or a treaty of surrender, or even a formal declaration. The League simply stopped meeting. The last act of the most powerful commercial organization in medieval European history was an absence, a silence where the merchants' voices had once been. Hamburg, Bremen and Lübeck continued to call themselves Hanseatic cities, a designation they retained formally to this day, embedded in their official names: the Free and Hanseatic city of Hamburg, the Free Hanseatic city of Bremen, the Hanseatic city of Lübeck. For Hamburg and Bremen, the survival was not merely nominal. Both cities went on to become major commercial centres in the Atlantic economy of the 17th and 18th centuries, adapting the Hanseatic traditions of commercial self-governance and merchant-led civic culture to the demands of a new world that the original Hansa would not have recognised. Walk through Tallinn, Estonia, on a winter evening, when the light is low and the temperature has dropped below freezing, and the cobblestones are glazed with a thin layer of ice that catches the glow of the street lamps, and you will walk through a city that the Hanseatic merchants built. The old town of Tallinn, called Reval by its German inhabitants for most of its history, is one of the best preserved medieval urban environments in Europe, and it is preserved so well partly by historical accident, and partly by the particular quality of Hanseatic civic culture, which tended to build in stone and brick because its merchants were wealthy enough to build well, and because they planned to stay. The Church of St. Olaf, which you can see from the harbour, was for several centuries the tallest building in the world, or so it was claimed by the citizens of Reval, a claim that other cities contested, but that reflects something real about the ambition of Hanseatic urban culture. The building soaring upward, visible to ships far out at sea, was at once a statement of faith and a statement of commercial intention. This city is here, it is prosperous, it is permanent, come and trade. The great merchants' houses on the streets of the lower city, tall narrow-fronted buildings with stepped gables and deep cellars for the storage of goods, speak in the same architectural language. They are buildings that say, "We're not passing through. We have built here and we intend to stay." In Lübeck, the old city sits on its river island almost exactly as the merchants who planned it left it. The Holstentor, the great double-towered gate that now serves as the city's emblem and appears on the old German 50-mark note, was built in 1478, at a time when the League was already beginning its long decline but had not yet fully recognised it, and it projects an authority and solidity that the city's political position at the time perhaps did not entirely warrant. The 7 churches of Old Lübeck, St. Mary's, St. Peter's, the Cathedral, St. Giles, St. James, St. Egidius, and the Hospital Church of the Holy Spirit, represent a density of sacred architecture that reflects the wealth the city accumulated over 3 centuries of commercial dominance. St. Mary's in particular, with its twin towers and its vast brick nave, is one of the great Gothic churches of Northern Europe, built by the same merchant community that extracted privileges from Danish kings and maintained trading posts in Novgorod. In Gdansk, Danzig to the German merchants who made it great, the Long Market and the Long Quay give you the most theatrical of all Hanseatic commercial landscapes, a wide open space lined with the elaborately decorated facades of merchant houses running down to the river and the harbour beyond. Much of what you see today in Gdansk is actually a reconstruction. The city was almost completely destroyed in the fighting of the 1945, but it was reconstructed with extraordinary fidelity to the original, using pre-war photographs and architectural surveys, because the people who rebuilt it understood that what they were preserving was not just buildings, but a particular way of imagining a city. The Hanseatic merchant city was not planned around a palace or a cathedral, though it had both. It was planned around the market, the square where goods changed hands, the quay where ships unloaded, the weighing house where commodities were measured and taxed. The commerce was the centre, and everything else was arranged around it. Riga, Stralsund, Greifswald, Rostock, Wismar, Bruges. Each of these cities carries the physical memory of Hanseatic prosperity in its architectural fabric. The brick Gothic style that the League favoured, simple and powerful, using the dark red brick that was available everywhere in the North Baltic region where stone was scarce, spread along the network's routes like a visual signature, a way of recognising at a glance that you were in Hanseatic territory. This style, called Backstein Gothic in German, is one of the most distinctive regional architectural traditions in Europe, and its distribution maps almost exactly onto the distribution of Hanseatic commercial power at its height. The Bergen Wharf, the Bryggen, has already been mentioned, but it deserves another moment. Bryggen today is a tourist attraction, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a collection of restaurants and shops and artisan studios housed in the dark timber buildings that line the harbour. On a summer day, when the Bergen light is doing its particular gentle thing with the water and the coloured facades of the wharf buildings are reflected in the harbour, it is easy to let it wash over you as simply beautiful. But the buildings carry, if you know where to look, the evidence of the world they once contained. The narrow passages between the buildings, too narrow for carts, designed for the movement of goods carried by hand, open onto courtyards where the warehouses backed up against the common areas, where disputes were settled and contracts made, and the life of the kontor conducted in the permanent disciplined collective that the Hanseatic merchant world required. The alley names still echo the old German community. The Schutzstuen, the assembly rooms where the merchants gathered, preserve in their layout the basic social architecture of the kontor system. The legacy of the Hansa is not only physical, it is embedded in the legal and commercial culture of the Baltic region in ways that are harder to see, but no less real. The tradition of merchant self-governance, the idea that commercial communities should regulate themselves, through their own institutions rather than depending on political authority, runs from the Hanseatic merchant guilds through the early modern commercial republics of Hamburg and Bremen, to the commercial law traditions of the modern Baltic states. The emphasis on contract as the foundation of commercial relationship, on reputation as the most valuable commercial asset, on the collective interest of the commercial community as something worth defending through organised action. These are Hanseatic ideas, developed in Hanseatic practice, transmitted through the long continuity of commercial culture in cities that have been trading centres for 7 or 8 centuries. When the European Union was founded in its modern form in the 1950s, it was building, consciously or not, on a tradition of European cooperative institutions that included the Hanseatic League as one of its most successful precedents. The comparison is not exact. The EU is a political institution with formal sovereignty in ways the Hansa never was, and its membership includes Mediterranean countries whose traditions are entirely different from the Baltic merchant culture the Hansa represented. But the core idea that independent states can achieve through collective organisation and negotiated rules what they cannot achieve through individual sovereignty is an idea that the merchants of Lübeck and Hamburg and Danzig and Riga would have recognised immediately. They had lived it. They had built it, one commercial privilege at a time, across 2 centuries of patient, persistent, sometimes violent negotiation with the powers that surrounded them. There is even a new Hanseatic League, a network of smaller European cities founded in 1980 that uses the old name to express a commitment to European cooperation and civic culture. It includes Bruges and Bergen and Tallinn and Riga and dozens of other cities that were members of the original league, along with cities that were never Hanseatic but share the tradition's values. It has no commercial power, no fleet, no ability to blockade anyone. But it carries the name, and the name still means something, still evokes a tradition of civic pride, commercial seriousness, and the conviction that cooperation between free cities can achieve things that no individual city can manage alone. This is, in the end, what is most remarkable about the Hanseatic League. Not the blockades, though they were dramatic, not the contours, though they were extraordinary, not the Treaty of Stralsund, though it was unprecedented. What is most remarkable is the simple, sustained achievement of making something hold together that had no right to hold together by any conventional theory of how power works. 200 cities, with no sovereign, no army, no enforcement mechanism beyond mutual interest, managed to act in concert often enough and decisively enough to shape the political and economic geography of Northern Europe for 3 centuries. They did it through trust, imperfect, contested, sometimes betrayed, but real enough to survive the strains that would have destroyed any more formally constituted institution. They did it through reputation, the accumulated credibility of generations of merchants who did what they said they would do, honoured their obligations, paid their debts. They did it through a genuinely sophisticated understanding of collective power that was not theoretical but practical, built from the bottom up through the daily experience of merchants who had learned that cooperation paid better than competition in an environment where either could work, but only one could work for everyone. The Baltic today is ringed by prosperous democracies: Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, whose cities are connected by ferry routes and fibre-optic cables, and the agreements of the European Union, trading freely across borders that were contested and bloody, within living memory. The cold grey sea is the same sea that the Hanseatic cogs crossed in their hundreds every autumn, laden with grain and fish and fur. The cities that line its shores still carry, in their architecture and their commercial culture, and sometimes in their very names, the memory of the merchants who made the North what it became. Somewhere in the structure of the world we have inherited, in the assumptions about how trade should work, how commercial disputes should be resolved, how cities should govern themselves and defend their interests, the Hanseatic merchants are still speaking. They are speaking in a language of practice rather than theory, a language of accumulated custom and institutional memory. But they are speaking, and if you know the history, you can hear them. Their world was cold and dangerous and full of the kind of casual violence that we have, in the prosperous north of the 21st century, largely managed to escape. The merchants themselves were not saints. They were capable of ruthlessness in the pursuit of commercial advantage, capable of exploiting the monopolies they held at the expense of the populations that depended on them, capable of the kinds of insider dealing and political manipulation that modern corporate governance exists to prevent. But they built something that lasted, and what they built was built on the understanding, never articulated as a theory but always present as a practice, that the stability of commercial relationships depends on a framework of trust and rules that no individual can maintain alone, and that defending that framework is worth almost any cost. Because without it, there is no commerce, And without commerce, in the interconnected world the Hansa created, there is no civilization. The last Hanseatic ship has long since been broken up or rotted at its dock. The last Hanseatic diet rose from the table in 1669 and never sat down again. The contours are gone. The Peterhof is rubble beneath the streets of Veliki Novgorod. The Bruges contour long demolished. The Bergen Wharf transformed into a heritage site. The steelyard built over by a Victorian railway station. The privileges are rescinded. The treaties obsolete. The legal frameworks that sustained the merchant communities dissolved into the successor legal systems of the nation-states that eventually absorbed them. But the cities remain. Walk through the Holstentor in Lübeck, and the dark brick closes around you, and you are inside a thing that the merchants built and that has outlasted everything they built for. Stand on the Bryggen in Bergen and look out at the harbour, and the same grey water stretches away to the north that the ships of the contour watched for 600 years, waiting for the season's fleet. Stand on the old town wall of Tallinn and look down at the roofs of the city that Hanseatic merchants built from scratch and left as their most durable monument, and understand that the most powerful economic organisation of the medieval world did not leave behind great battles or great art or great religious movements. It left behind cities. It left behind commerce. It left behind the quiet, durable, entirely unromantic understanding that the way to shape the world is not through conquest, but through the patient construction of systems. Systems of trade, systems of trust, systems of collective action, that once built, prove almost impossible to destroy because too many people depend on them to let them fall. The Hanseatic merchants knew this. They built their empire on it, and in the cities they left behind, in the legal traditions they established, in the commercial culture they created and transmitted across the centuries, that knowledge persists. The League is gone, but the insight that created it, that cooperation, patiently and persistently pursued, is a more durable form of power than conquest, is as alive now as it was when a group of German merchants on a Swedish island looked at each other across the cold Baltic and decided for the first time that they would be stronger together than apart. The cold water is still there, the cogs are gone, but the cities they built are full of light. There is a particular quality to the light in Lübeck on a clear autumn day that seems to illuminate not just the present but the deep past, a cool, low-angled northern light that catches the red brick of the church towers and turns it golden, that falls across the narrow streets of the old town in long parallelograms and makes the city look, for a moment, not like a heritage site or a tourist destination, but like a living thing, inhabited not just by its current residents, but by every merchant and shipowner and apprentice and alderman who ever walked these same streets in the 7 centuries since the city was built. This quality of light, and the streets it illuminates, and the buildings those streets connect, these are the Hanseatic League's most visible legacy, and they are remarkable, but they are only the surface of something that goes much deeper. The merchants who built these cities left behind more than brick and mortar. They left behind a way of thinking about commerce, governance, and collective action that has shaped the cultures of the Baltic region in ways that are still being discovered and debated by historians and economists. The emphasis on written contracts and documentary evidence that was central to Hanseatic commercial practice, the insistence that every agreement be recorded, witnessed, and preserved, contributed to the development of commercial law traditions in the Baltic that were more sophisticated and more systematically documented than those in most other parts of Europe at the same period. The archives that Hanseatic cities maintained, the municipal records, the merchant guild accounts, the diplomatic correspondence of the diets, are among the most extensive and most detailed collections of medieval commercial documentation anywhere in existence, and they continue to yield new insights as historians work through them. The Hanseatic emphasis on civic self-governance, the idea that a city's merchant community should have a decisive say in its own administration, contributed to the development of urban political cultures in the Baltic that were more participatory and more legally sophisticated than those in many feudal territories. The great Hanseatic cities governed themselves through councils dominated by the merchant oligarchy, but these councils operated under rules and customs that provided more predictability and more protection for established interests than the arbitrary power of a feudal lord. This was not democracy in any modern sense, but it was a form of governance that placed procedural regularity and commercial predictability above the personal whims of any individual ruler, and in an age when the alternative was often precisely those personal whims, this was genuinely significant. The commercial techniques that Hanseatic merchants developed and disseminated across the Baltic network were, in many cases, at the cutting edge of medieval financial innovation. The use of letters of credit, written instruments that allowed a merchant to access funds in a distant city without physically transporting coin, was central to Hanseatic commercial practice, enabling the rapid movement of commercial value across distances that would otherwise have required months of slow physical transport. The development of partnerships and commercial agencies, legal arrangements that allowed merchants to pool capital and share risk across multiple ventures, reduced the financial vulnerability of individual traders and enabled larger, more ambitious commercial operations than any single merchant could fund alone. The insurance arrangements that began to develop around Hanseatic trade in the 14th and 15th centuries, informal at first, gradually more systematic, represent an early stage in the long history of risk management that leads eventually to the modern insurance industry. These innovations were not created in a vacuum. They were created in response to specific practical problems that the Hanseatic trade network presented. The problem of moving value across long distances in a world without reliable physical transport. The problem of sharing risk across ventures that were too large for any single merchant to absorb alone. The problem of verifying the creditworthiness of trading partners whom you had never met and might never meet in person. The solutions the merchants devised were practical and specific, oriented toward the immediate problem rather than toward any general theory of commercial finance. And yet the cumulative effect of these practical innovations was the creation of a commercial infrastructure that was, in several important respects, more sophisticated than anything the feudal world had previously produced. The Hanseatic cities also left behind, scattered across the Baltic, a remarkable collection of artifacts that continue to emerge from the water, the ground, and the archives with the frequency of historical gifts. The Bremen cog has already been mentioned. Discovered in the Weser in 1962 and now displayed in the German Maritime Museum, it is the most complete surviving example of the ship that built the network. But it is not alone. The waters of the Baltic are extraordinarily well preserved by cold and low salinity, and they have given up, over the years, dozens of medieval wrecks that help reconstruct the physical reality of the Hanseatic trade. Each new discovery adds another layer of detail to our understanding of how the ships were built, how they were loaded, what they carried, how they navigated. The cargo of the Gribschunden, a Danish royal warship that sank off the coast of Sweden in 1495, included exotic spices and preserved foods that document the luxury trade of the late Hanseatic period with extraordinary precision. The Mary Rose is English and not Hanseatic, but the Baltic wrecks of the same period offer comparable insights into the material culture of Northern European maritime commerce. The archives are equally rich and equally revealing. The Hanseatic records preserved in Lübeck's municipal archive, the Archiv der Hansestadt Lübeck, fill kilometres of shelf space, and they contain everything from the minutes of Hanseatic diets to the personal correspondence of individual merchants to the account books of contour administrators. Scholars who work in these archives regularly encounter moments of extraordinary immediacy. A letter from a merchant in Novgorod describing the difficulties of the winter trade, a complaint from a Bergen apprentice about the severity of the initiation rituals, a diplomatic note from Lübeck to the King of England politely but firmly, insisting on the restoration of the Steelyard's privileges, that collapse the distance of 7 centuries and make the people who wrote them feel suddenly, disconcertingly present. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Hanse's legacy is the way it has been repeatedly rediscovered and reinterpreted by later generations for their own purposes. In the 19th century, when Germany was struggling toward national unification, the Hanseatic League was celebrated by German nationalists as evidence of the essential unity and commercial genius of the German people, an organisation that had, without the benefit of a German state, achieved something that surpassed the achievements of the existing German states. This interpretation was selective and somewhat distorted. The Hanse was never exclusively German. Its eastern cities were multilingual communities where German coexisted with Polish, Russian, and the Baltic languages, and its commercial success owed as much to geography and historical circumstance as to any ethnic characteristic. But it was politically potent, and it helped establish the League's reputation as one of the great achievements of German history. In the 20th century, the Hansa was claimed by different interpretive traditions. For the architects of European integration after 1945, the League represented a precedent for the idea that European states could cooperate in their economic interests without surrendering their political sovereignty, a medieval example of the functional integration theory that underlay the early European community. For economic historians developing the new institutional economics of the 1980s and 1990s, the League became a test case for theories about how private organizations can provide the institutional infrastructure, contract enforcement, information sharing, reputation mechanisms that formal legal systems sometimes fail to supply. For historians of globalization, the Hansa represented an early example of the kind of transnational commercial network that the modern global economy has produced at vastly larger scale. Each of these interpretations captures something real. Each also reflects the preoccupations of the era that produced it, reading the medieval merchants through a contemporary lens that the merchants themselves would not have recognized. This is inevitable, perhaps necessary. We can only understand the past through the questions our present forces us to ask, but it is also a reminder that the Hanseatic League was not a precedent for anything. It was a thing in itself, a human creation shaped by specific circumstances, specific people, and specific choices, and understanding it on its own terms is the beginning of understanding why it still matters. Each of these interpretations captures something real. The League was a genuine precedent for European cooperation. It was a genuine example of private institutional innovation. It was a genuine early stage in the globalization of commercial networks. But it was also, and most fundamentally, a human story. A story of merchants who were frightened of the cold and the sea and the arbitrary power of kings, who discovered that they were less frightened when they worked together, and who built, on the foundation of that discovery, something that lasted 3 centuries and shaped the economic geography of an entire continent. The last thing to say about the Hanseatic League is the thing that gets lost most easily in the historical narrative: the sheer human scale of the achievement. When we talk about the League's commercial statistics, the tonnage of grain shipped, the value of furs traded, the profits accumulated in the contours, we are talking about numbers that can make the enterprise seem impersonal and mechanical. But behind every number was a human decision, made by a human being, in a specific place and time, under the pressure of uncertainty and the weight of accumulated obligation. The merchant who decided to extend credit to a business partner he had never met, on the basis of a mutual acquaintance's recommendation, was not making an abstract commercial calculation. He was making a judgment about a human being, and he was taking a risk that could, if the judgment was wrong, cost him everything he had built. The apprentice in the Bergen contour who endured years of harsh training to become a full member of the merchant community was not simply pursuing commercial advantage. He was investing in an identity, becoming part of something larger than himself that had meaning beyond its commercial function. The delegates who travelled to Lübeck for Hanseatic diets, sometimes from cities a month's journey away, through weather that could kill a man and roads that could break an axle, were not just doing business. They were participating in a collective enterprise that they believed correctly was important enough to justify the journey. The cold grey Baltic stretches north from Tallinn and Lübeck and Dansk, exactly as it did when the first Hanseatic cog set out across it, heavy with the goods that kept northern Europe alive. The winds that fill the sails of modern yachts in those waters are the same winds that drove the merchant ships of the 14th century. The cities that line the coast are built on the foundations that the merchants laid, in the streets they walked, in the spaces they created for commerce and worship and governance. The League is gone, but the world it made remains, and those who know the history can see it everywhere they look. In the stepped gables of a warehouse in Riga, in the weighing house of a Dutch city, in the sound of German being spoken in a city that was built by German merchants on a Slavic coast 8 centuries ago, in the legal traditions that still shape the commercial cultures of the Baltic states, in the simple, durable, endlessly rediscoverable truth that people who cooperate can do what people who compete alone cannot. The merchants of the Hansa did not set out to change the world. They set out to sell grain and fish and fur without losing their ships. What they built, in the process, was a world. And that world, like most worlds that are genuinely built rather than merely inherited, was built one careful, calculated, collectively negotiated step at a time, in the cold and the dark, on water that never promised to be kind. The Baltic tonight is the same sea it has always been. Cold, grey, restless, indifferent to the ambitions of the people who sail it. Somewhere under those waters, off the coast of Gotland, in the shallows of the Gulf of Danzig, in the muddy narrows of the rivers that once carried the grain and the furs and the salt, the wrecks of the Hanseatic cogs are still settling into the silt, still releasing, particle by particle, the cargo they were carrying when they went down. Each one is a message in a bottle, a document of a specific moment in the life of a network that moves civilization across the water. The archaeologists who find them, who pull the timbers up into the light after 6 or 7 centuries of darkness, are reading those messages carefully. And what the messages say, consistently, across every wreck and every archive and every merchant letter that has survived is this: that the most durable form of power is not force, but system. That the most important thing any commercial community can build is not wealth, but trust. And that the cold, grey, indifferent sea can be crossed by anyone with a good ship, a reliable partner, and the patience to build something that will last longer than either of them.